Hello and welcome to Three Rooms Press and Hub City Press present Queer Rural Fiction, a conversation with authors Julia Watts and Carter Sickels. Julia Watts is the author of Needlework, a novel that's coming out October 5th, 2021. It's about a boy in rural Kentucky that loves quilting, cooking, and Dolly Parton helps his grandmother care for his opioid-addicted mother, and then discovers a family secret that upends everything he ever believed. Carter Sickels is the award-winning author of The Prettiest Star. This novel talks about Brian Jackson, who returns to a small Appalachian hometown after his family have rejected him for a homecoming. His book deserves a place in the canon of AIDS literature. It is out now and, as mentioned, has won many awards. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Carter and Julia.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Kat.
Hey, Julia.
Hey, Carter.
Hey. Do you want to talk about what your book is about first?
Sure. I have the beautiful arc of it here. They just came the other day. There we go. I'll finally get it in the frame. It's a young adult novel, but of course, these days we know that young adult is not limited to just young adults, but to anybody who wants to read it. And as Kat was saying, it's about a teenage boy, Cody. He's 16 years old. He's growing up in rural Southeastern Kentucky and is feeling the blight of the opioid epidemic because his mother is an opioid addict. He and his grandma kind of take care of her and try to take care of themselves, but it's a struggle. And another struggle that Cody faces is that he knows he's gay, but also knows that the people who around him who love him most might not accept that. And then he does discover a huge secret, which I'm not going to give away because that would be a spoiler. Yeah, I think that it reflects a lot of what's going on in the region right now. And I have your beautiful book, Prettiest Star, here too, which I've read, but I'm going to pretend like I haven't. So you can tell me and potential readers about it.
I'll put it up here too. Thank you.
I know it's kind of harder than you think to move things in frame.
It is. Well, I loved your book, and I think it's really beautiful, and it does speak to so many of the current issues going on in Appalachia right now. But my novel, it takes place in 1986, and it takes place in a small rural Appalachian town in southeastern Ohio. And it follows Brian Jackson, a young gay man who's been diagnosed with HIV and estranged from his family and living in New York since he was 18. And he's lost friends and his lover to AIDS, and he decides to return to that small town. And when he goes back home, his parents try to keep his sexuality and his HIV status a secret, and that secrecy and shame really weighs on Brian and on the family as rumors start to spread. And it's told the perspectives of Brian and his mother, Sharon, and his 14-year-old sister. And like your novel, also features a Mammal, the grandmother character. But yeah, I think it's about queerness and illness, but also about and prejudices, but also about love, right? And how the power of love in a family.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a beautiful book, and as someone who was around in 1986 in that just most brutal time of the AIDS epidemic, I think you captured that so beautifully, particularly the fears that that people had, the completely irrational fears that people, the straight people especially, and I think it was probably even more intense in rural areas without large out gay communities. Just the level of hysteria that people were feeling. But yeah, it's lovely. Can you talk to me a little bit about maybe like where you grew up and what you grew up reading and kind of how you grew into this fantastic queer Appalachian writer?
Thank you. Yeah, I grew up more in central Ohio, like southeast of Columbus, in a very rural and small town, though. But I spent significant time in Appalachia, in Ohio, where my grandparents and most of my family's from. And I went to college at Ohio University. So the landscape really shifts in that part of Ohio from flatland to rolling hills, not mountains, but rolling hills. You know, when I was a kid, like most writers, I read pretty voraciously, and I ate up all the Beverly Cleary books, little Judy Blume. Around 5th or 6th grade, I read The Outsiders, which I became pretty obsessed with. And I think it showed me a way that boys could be vulnerable and tender. And I identified with Pony Boy, who's the sort of sensitive greaser. And at some point I read To Kill a Mockingbird too. But there were no, as you know, there were no YA books with queer characters back then. And, you know, so I think I learned a lot about myself and the world and queerness through like looking at these books through a queer lens, right? And identifying with these sensitive boys or these like tomboy girls.
Right.
So I'm curious about your reading experience and where you're
from. Yeah, I grew up in rural Southeastern Kentucky. And also was a voracious reader. I don't want to derail the conversation to be about Beverly Cleary, but her recent passing has made me reflect on how much joy her books brought and really still bring me.
Yes.
But I read, you know, everything there was to read in the juvenile section. They called it juvenile back then, of the small town library. But also, as I got a little older, my dad was an English professor at a small Baptist college, and he would bring home these desk copies of literature anthologies, and so I just started reading everything in those, and that's how I discovered some of the great Southern authors. You know, I think Eudora Welty and Flannery O'Connor especially stand out to me when I'm thinking about those. But yeah, I think I also read between the lines some because of there not being YA books featuring queer characters. So, you know, I really like Scout Finch. You know, I really like the character of Caddy Woodlawn, who was a very feisty, young girl. You know, I always thought there was something going on between Bess and George in the Nancy Drew books, though, and you can't convince me otherwise. I really think that they were a couple. They just had to keep it on the down low, you know, given the time and place. So yeah, it's you know, the way we read growing up, because we're so hungry, right? We're so desperate to, you know, to see mirrors of ourselves in some ways.
Absolutely. And your book, I mean, I think, you know, had I had your book when I was 13 or 14 or 12 years old, you know, it really would have given me another way of understanding kind of myself, and to feel that there were other young queer people out there presented in a positive but complex light. And so it seems like from reading your work that place Appalachia, the South, and queerness is so important to what you write. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, or?
Yeah, sure. And I think that's something that I'd like to hear you talk about too, because I could certainly say the same of your work. Yeah, I think that when I was a kid, a lot of the books I read were about people in New York or California. You know, I kind of got the feeling that stories happen somewhere else, right? That you left, and that's where stuff happened. I think reading Bobby Ann Mason's work, I read In Country when I was about 15 years old, and I was like, oh wow, this is about a teenage girl in Kentucky, you could write a book about a teenage girl in Kentucky, you know? So I started thinking, you know, over time, about, you know, writing about things that reflected more, you know, the people I grew up around and the way I grew up, because once again, that's something that I didn't see for the most part in what I was reading, and something that I very much wanted to. How about you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I like what you said about this idea that like queer stories are always told in cities, right? And that's kind of the representation that we get. And of course, there are queer people living their lives in rural places. Sometimes they leave those places and come back, and sometimes they stay. But I think for me, like place and then my queer trans identity kind of have shaped me as a person, and also everything that I write. And for the Prettiest Star in particular, like, you know, I felt like most of the stories we read about the AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s take place in New York and San Francisco. And that makes sense because those areas were so devastated. But there were men who were in the South and rural areas in Appalachia. And I wanted to write about one of those men and look at the epidemic, you know, through that lens of rural America. And I hope tell a story that I think has been overlooked, you know, with about these rural communities and families who'd rejected some of these men, and then what did that homecoming look like, you know, for my character, for Brian.
Because I think most of the great AIDS fiction of the 80s that was coming out during that era, very much the men staying in that urban environment. And you might hear, oh, you know, he came from Kentucky or he came from Ohio or whatever, but he doesn't go back, right? So I thought that was incredibly compelling. And also the stories of people who stay, need to be told as well. And I think we see that in your work also.
Yes. Thank you. Well, I'm sure that you hear back from fans of your work. Is there anything in particular that's, you know, meant something to you from hearing back from readers?
Yeah, I mean, anytime I hear from a teenager, that's really meaningful to me. Actually, one recent comment that I got after Quiver was from a trans young man who read it and who had been raised in a very fundamentalist household, very much like Libby's, raised, of course, as a girl conforming to every gender stereotype, forced to, and he talked about how meaningful that had been to him. So that was very special. How about you?
That's so great. Yeah. I've heard back from people, and I also heard from a young trans man who had read a piece of mine and just felt like he'd seen himself in a way that he hadn't before, and could connect with the work. And then I did hear back from someone who lost friends and lovers to AIDS and thought I captured the rural experience in a way that he hadn't seen before. And of course, that feels very significant and special. And I think, you know, there's just such a need out there and a hunger for full and complicated queer rural representation.
All right. Well, this is a short conversation. I wish we could just keep going and going. I'm loving all the things that you're talking about. But we did want to wrap it up. Enjoyed your conversation.